survive on its own if you break it away from the chain. And that means they're not truly multicellular. You can't take your own cells from your body and separate them from each other and have them to live. They are dependent on each other. But these guys just sort of happen to be stuck together. And that's called a filamentous structure. People tend to associate bacteria with diseases, and in a way that's kind of unfair to the bacteria. Most bacteria neither harm us nor help us. Some of them are actually very beneficial to us, and yeah, a few cause diseases, but those are definitely the minority of bacteria. Some of the ones that help us here I've listed. This one you see here is an example of a cyanobacteria. They do photosynthesis, so they're making oxygen for us is how they're helping us. Now, I think people, when they think of photosynthesis and oxygen, they associate it with the plants, and certainly plants do photosynthesis and make oxygen for us. But the fact is that plants almost exclusively live on the dry land, and most of the Earth's surface is covered with water. And in the water, it's a lot of these cyanobacteria that are making oxygen. And I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but over half of the oxygen that we breathe comes from cyanobacteria and not from plants. One second. Another aspect of the bacteria helping us are ones that decompose dead things for us. This is supposed to be a simplified diagram of the food chain. Plants grow, animals feed on those plants, and then other animals feed on those animals. The nutrients that the plants produce work their way upward through the food chain. But to sustain their growth, plants need to get nutrients out of the soil, things like nitrates and phosphates and whatnot. The plant has to take up to sustain its own growth. And where do those nutrients go? Well, those nutrients eventually go back down onto the ground when these animals or the plants themselves die. But those nutrients have to be broken back down into their basic parts, into their phosphates and nitrates, before the plants can use them again. And that's where the bacteria and the fungi, which are the relatives of the mushrooms, come in. Both of those are decomposers. And so by breaking down the nutrients of dead plants and animals, they return the nutrients to the soil, and that allows the plants to keep growing and keeps the food chain running. And there's kind of a related concept to this called nitrogen fixation. One of the nutrients that plants need to get out of the soil are nutrients containing nitrogen, such as ammonium or nitrates that occur naturally in the soil. And so, as I said before, the plants would very quickly deplete these soil nutrients, the nitrogen-containing soil nutrients, if there wasn't some way to put nitrogen back into the soil. Well, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air in the form of N2 gas. So you might think at first, well, do the plants just get nitrogen gas out of the air to meet their nitrogen needs? And the answer is no. The problem is that that nitrogen gas that the atmosphere has a lot of has a triple covalent bond between the two nitrogen atoms. It's one of the few triple covalent bonds that you find in the molecules around us. And that makes those two nitrogen atoms very, very difficult to split apart. And plants just do not have an enzyme that can break those apart so it can use the individual nitrogen atoms. But certain types of bacteria do. They do have the right enzyme for splitting those apart. And those are called the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so what these bacteria do is they live in the soil and they fix the nitrogen, meaning they split apart the N2 and convert it into ammonia and other forms that the plants can use. And that helps replenish the nitrogen compounds in the soil. As a matter of fact, some plants have found ways to increase the amount of nitrogen-fixing bacteria around their roots so that they get more nitrogen that way. This shows the root system of some sort of legume. Legumes are the bean plants. And you can see these little white nodules all along the roots. Well, for a long time, early botanists were confused about what the purpose of these nodules are, and they now know that they are essentially nitrogen-fixing bacteria structures that the legumes grow. The legumes provide a nice environment for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, so the bacteria benefit by having a nice place to live, and the plant benefits by housing all these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So it ends up making so much nitrates and ammonia for the plant that a lot of it leaks out of the plant and goes into the soil itself. And so one of the upshots of this is that if a farmer grows plants of the bean family, it actually adds more nutrients to the soil than the plant itself uses. The farmer can use less fertilizer by virtue of growing these legume plants. All right, and so some, not many, but some bacteria are disease-causing, and any living organism that causes a disease is said to be pathogenic, means disease-causing organism. And this is a table I ripped off from some other textbook, but I think there's a table like this somewhere in your textbook. It lists some human diseases that are caused by bacteria. Somewhere on here, if I find it, is cholera. Well, there it is right there. This is actually caused by some of those same microbes that live in our large intestine. There we go. So your intestines have lots of prokaryotes, including bacteria living in them. But they don't make us ill as long as they're contained inside our intestines. And our intestine walls are pretty thick to stop them from spreading to other body parts. But the problem is, in countries that don't have very advanced sewage treatment systems, a lot of times human feces just gets dumped into lakes and rivers. And then when people use that as their water source, they end up drinking in somebody else's intestinal bacteria, and that makes them, that will make the person ill. These are some of the intestinal bacteria up close. And anyway, so finding a safe water supply is one of the biggest challenges to human health around the world. We hear about people dying of famines and things in some countries, but if you look at how many people die each year from having contaminated water as their drinking water, it far outweighs the number of people who die of famines. I forgot the exact number, but I think they said 5 or 10 million people every year die who would not have died just because they don't have a safe water supply. And cholera is one of the main diseases that you can get from drinking water contaminated with feces. This is a Salmonella bacteria. It's found on some raw meats and eggs, and for some reason it seems to be especially high in things we get from chickens, like chicken meat and eggs. I'm not sure exactly why that particular species, but that's why they always tell you be sure and cook your chicken quite thoroughly, because you have to cook off the Salmonella bacteria. Did you have a question?
I heard that doctors do fecal transplants where they'll feed you someone else's fecal matter.
Whoa.
To reestablish the bacteria.
Oh, I think I know what you're saying. Like
antibiotics.
Yeah, if they give you a lot of antibiotics, that kills off some of the bacteria that normally exist in your large intestine. And that's actually, we actually need those bacteria. That we benefit from them in some ways. And so if they give you a lot of antibiotics, they have to sort of reestablish the bacteria living in your guts. And I'd not heard about transferring feces from one person to another, but you can buy things in health food stores called probiotics, which are really rich in bacteria, safe bacteria, and you're supposed to eat those to help reestablish your guts. But I guess the thing you're describing might be possible. It sounds a little strange to me.
Is that for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely heard that. Was it in the show called The Doctors? It's kind of like a
Okay, all right.
So yeah,
It is real?
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Pretty much it just cleans out the colon.
okay,
So it gets all the bacteria.
all right. But I mean, they don't actually make you eat somebody else's
No,
feces?
no, they don't make it themselves. Like down your throat.
They put-
They kind of like
Okay. All right. And let's move on to something slightly more tasteful. I listed pneumonia here. Pneumonia is where fluids build up in your lungs and you have difficulty breathing. That can be caused by several different microscopic organisms, but definitely some bacteria can cause it. And a few things I didn't list here. This is the bacteria that causes cavities in your teeth. If you don't brush your teeth after a meal, the food that gets stuck between your teeth and whatnot starts being broken down by bacteria. And as a byproduct, these bacteria make acids, which eat away at the enamel in your teeth, which makes a little hole in your tooth called a cavity. And the problem is that cavity then becomes a place where even more of these bacteria can grow. And so the cavity gets larger and larger until you have to go to the dentist and get it repaired. And this is someone who has Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a bacterial infection, but it's transmitted by ticks like you see here. And so if you go hiking out in the woods somewhere and you find you've been bitten by a tick, keep an eye on the wound. If you see something that looks like sort of like a bullseye target, like a red area getting larger and larger around the tick bite, that's Lyme disease and you need to get treated for it. This map shows the states where there's the most Lyme disease. It looks like in the Northeast you find the most of it, but certainly in California we have a little bit of it. Okay, well, the next thing in your handout starts talking about some of the genetics of bacteria, and I want to begin that part today. So this is my cartoon of a bacteria again, and just to remind you a little bit about what you already know. Of course, the prokaryotes don't have a nucleus. They only have that one circular chromosome. And it typically has a few thousand genes. Somewhere in the order of 2,000, 3,000, or 4,000 genes is typical for a bacteria. In addition to their chromosome, in some bacteria, not all bacteria, but in some bacteria, you can also find little DNA structures called plasmids. And a plasmid is almost like a miniature version of the main chromosome. A plasmid is not technically called a chromosome, but it is a small circular loop of DNA. And each plasmid only contains about 100 genes or so. And I guess I would describe these as supplemental genes or maybe bonus genes for the bacteria. The genes that you find on the plasmids are not necessary for the bacteria to survive under most conditions. For instance, the genes for making the cell wall and the genes for breaking down glucose for energy, all those regular genes that the bacteria needs to survive under most conditions are there on its chromosome. But over here, on the plasmids, genes for surviving under special circumstances. For instance, these drugs called antibiotics can kill off bacteria, but you probably know that some bacteria are resistant to antibiotics. And those bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics have genes on their plasmids that give them that resistance. Those genes help the bacteria to survive, but only if the bacteria happens to be in an environment where there's a lot of the antibiotics. And as a preview of something that's going to come up in lab later on this week, biotechnologists have found a way to splice different genes into the plasmids, to put genes on there from plants and animals and other species that are completely different from the bacteria. And of course, then the bacteria will express those genes. And so you can use these plasmids to turn bacteria into gene factories to make any gene product that you want them to, whether it's a bacterial gene or a human gene or a plant gene. I guess I mentioned this already. They divide by something called binary fission. They don't have to go through S phase or G1 or G2 or anything like that, or metaphase or prophase. They just duplicate their chromosome, and then immediately the two duplicated chromosomes move apart from each other. The cell divides, and that's it. It's a very, very quick process. And one final concept here. There is no sexual reproduction among bacteria. There are not male bacteria and female bacteria to mate with each other and mix their genes in the offspring. It's asexual, non-sexual reproduction. When a bacteria divides, the two daughter cells are exact duplicates, the same genetically as the mother cell. And yet they have shown that genes can pass between bacteria. They did an experiment where they had one species of bacteria with a functional gene. I think it was a gene for making a certain amino acid. And they had a separate species of bacteria that had a non-functional version of that gene. In other words, this one almost had a genetic disease, if you want to think about it that way. And they allowed these bacteria to grow up together. And what they found is the one that had the bad copy of the gene, up on top, so to speak, ended up getting the good copy of the gene from this other species of bacteria. And so if these bacteria aren't mating with each other, how could this one,